The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com.
Welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. If you're a fan of classic theatrical comedies, you might recognize Richard Brinsley Sheridan as the author of such hits as The School for Scandal and The Rivals. But we should also pay more attention to his melodrama Pizarro, because it just might be one of the most important plays that you've never heard of. Our guests today are Dr. Selena Couture and Dr. Alexander Dick. Selena is an assistant professor in the drama department at the University of Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and Métis homelands, while Alex is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of British Columbia, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam and Coast Salish peoples. Together, they've produced a new critical edition of Pizarro, which is available from Broadview Press. Selena and Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
Can you tell us about Richard Brinsley Sheridan and how Pizarro fits into his career?
Sure. Sheridan was born in Dublin in 1751, and though he's sometimes thought of as an Irish writer, his family moved to England when he was 7, and he never went back. He came from an intellectual household. His father, Thomas Sheridan, is best known now as an elocutionist and a teacher of elocution, who published books on language and rhetoric, and who had a fairly big influence on Enlightenment thinkers, including probably most famously Thomas Jefferson. He was also an actor and a theater manager in Ireland and then again in England. Sheridan's mother, Frances, was also a playwright and a novelist, and some listeners may know her novel The Memoirs of Sidney Biddulph, which was part of the sentimental school, strongly influenced by Samuel Richardson's Pamela. At any rate, Sheridan came from an intellectual, theatrical household, but not a wealthy one. His parents moved around a lot, especially away from creditors. Nevertheless, Sheridan had a good education, first at home and then at Harrow School, which is one of the oldest and best-known public schools in England. And when he left school, he didn't really have a profession, per se. He was what we call a gentleman. He eventually found himself in the resort town of Bath, where he fell in love with a young singer named Elizabeth Linley. And this is really how Sheridan's career as a dramatist starts. Linley was at the time being pursued by a married man named Thomas Matthews. Long story short, Matthews challenges Sheridan to fight a duel. Sheridan wins, but without hurting Matthews, and Matthews is forced to write a retraction, which is then published. And this causes a kind of public shaming of Matthews. Matthews gets mad again, challenges Sheridan to another duel, and this time Matthews wins, and Sheridan gets hurt, but he recovers, and he and Elizabeth elope to France. Now, the reason this is important is because this story became the basis for Sheridan's first play, The Rivals, which comes out in 1771, and it's a huge hit. Sheridan realizes that he's got a new career, and he writes a whole series of very funny plays, including, as you've already mentioned, The School for Scandal, which comes out in 1777, and which was the most popular and frequently performed play of the 18th century, the second of which is our play Pizarro. And it's a satire on melodramatic sentimentalism. And his other most famous play is The Critic, which is a satire of theatrical spectacle and mass marketing. And what's interesting about this in relation to Pizarro is that Sheridan ended up using both of the techniques, high sentiment and high spectacle, that he was satirizing in his early comedies in Pizarro. In the meantime, Sheridan also becomes important enough and financially secure enough to buy one of the two Royal Theatres, Drury Lane, with his father and father-in-law, and he actually owns it for almost the rest of his life. In 1780, Sheridan entered Parliament, and he was a Whig, which means that he had fairly liberal views on commerce and freedom and whatnot, pro-American Revolution, for instance. But he was still very much involved with wealthy country landowners. He was a very successful orator, but he never held a government post, at least not for very long. And he was also running a theater, which Selena's going to talk about in a minute. But he didn't write for the theater between 1781 and 1799, so almost 20 years without an original play. Pizarro ended up being his last work, and it was a complete turnaround, as I've mentioned, from his other works. It's a huge spectacle, and it's pure melodrama, with oversized villains and excruciatingly noble heroes and heroines. But it's also the culmination of his political life. It touches on issues of national and even racial identity, revolution and liberty, the colonial conquest of the Americas, all of which were absolutely at the top of the cultural mind in Britain at the end of the 18th century. And in the 19th century, Pizarro became a strong part of the British and international repertoire, playing in America and as far away as India and Sri Lanka. But in the 20th century, as trends turned toward modernism, its spectacle and melodrama were thought weaker than the wittier comedies, and so it fell out of the repertoire and the critical conversation about Sheridan and about drama for almost a century. But it's come back of late because the conversations about literature and theater have turned to these issues, these political issues that Sheridan was interested in and which he was addressing in Pizarro.
Now, this is a pretty big turnaround, as you were saying, from Sheridan's early comedies, then a career in politics, and then all of a sudden we get this play. Where did he get the idea for it, and what does it have to do with this phenomenon called Kotzebue mania?
Yeah, so a really important thing to remember about this play is that Sheridan actually didn't write it, or write the story at any rate. It was a translation of a massive 10-act, 2-play extravaganza by the German playwright August Ferdinand von Kotzebue. As you mentioned, Kotzebue came from a wealthy merchant family in Weimar, and he was a friend of important German writers like Goethe and even Beethoven. He was a political and cultural minister in Russia and in Austria and all over Germany, and he actually held quite radical political views for the time, and in fact, he was assassinated in 1819. But in the 1790s, Kotzebue was known as the author of a number of notorious novels and spectacular melodramas in what we call the Sturm und Drang tradition, the thunder and lightning of German tragedy. And though it was often excoriated by critics, the risque themes of Kotzebue's plays, personal liberty, premarital sex, illegitimacy, guaranteed full houses. So Drury Lane had mounted a lucrative production of Kotzebue's Menschenhaus und Ruhe, translated as The Stranger, in 1798, and it featured Sheridan's two lead actors, John Philip Kemble and Sarah Siddons. And in the same year, Covent Garden, the other theatre royal, produced Kotzebue's Das Kind der Liebe, or The Natural Child, which was translated as Lover's Vows by the relatively well-known English author Elizabeth Inchbald. And this is, in fact, the scandalous play that the young characters fail to mount in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. So Kotzebue was well-known, very popular, risque and trendy, and this is one of the reasons why Sheridan picked his play. But the Kotzebue trend didn't make everybody happy. Contemporary reactions to Kotzebue's popularity show both an emerging romantic aesthetic of originality and its nationalistic impulses. Sickly and stupid German tragedies is what Wordsworth called them in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1800, while Pizarro was still on the boards. And these were prominent in the English theatrical repertoire through the period. London audiences were in the grips of what one writer, Frederick Reynolds, called a cruel disease, and this is what became Kotzebue mania. It was thought of as a kind of illness, a bit like, other manias are treated today, pop culture manias, like the way we talk about cell phones or that kind of thing. The patients of this disease, and I'm quoting from Reynolds' article, were afflicted with a childish passion for noise, faintings, the startings and ravings of others deeply affected with the same. The sickness made women of every rank divest themselves of a great part of their clothes and cut off their hair. The symptoms of Kotzebue mania were especially apparent in the theaters where the people thronged and where the old and the young, the grave and the gay hastened like insects to flutter round the flame of licentiousness. So Pizarro was often used as a key example of Kotzebue mania, simply because the play was crazy popular. And in our edition, we've produced several accounts of the crush at the theaters and people fainting and fighting and desperate to get seats and tickets. Needless to say, it was just a monumental success.
Yes, and it sounds like the play itself is pretty wild. This thing has everything. It's got babies on stage, collapsing bridges, you name it. Can you tell us a little bit about the plot of Pizarro?
Sure, I'll jump in here. So its subject is the Spanish conquest of the Incan Empire in Peru. in the early 16th century. But I'd like to emphasize that this is the European concept of Spanish conquest, in sort of air quotes capitalized, which is the subject of Kotzebue's original play. And scholars now usually refer to the Spanish imperial invasion of the Americas rather than the idea of the Spanish conquest because of the fact that indigenous peoples were never fully conquered in that kind of way that Europeans considered it. The complicated nature of this and the way the play was used to both perpetuate the concept of conquest as well as respond to and manipulate this construction in later iterations of it is part of why it originally captured my attention. But back to the plot. So it opens on a magnificent pavilion where Pizarro and his conquistadors debate plans to subdue the Incas and kill their former compatriot, Alonso, who has switched his allegiance to the Peruvian side and married a Peruvian woman, Cora, who was formerly betrothed to the warrior Rola, a major leader in the Peruvian side. The Spanish attack the Peruvians at their capital during a ceremony. Alonso is captured during the battle and condemned to death. When Pizarro's Spanish mistress, Elvira, who's a former novice nun who's followed him to Peru, learns that he intends to kill the captured Alonso, she turns against him, calling him cowardly for killing a man who's a prisoner, and decides to enlist Alonso's help to assassinate Pizarro. Meanwhile, goaded by Cora, who is the woman who's married to Alonso, Rola secretly takes Alonso's place. He sneaks into the Spanish camp, takes his place, frees him so he can go back to his wife and child. And when Elvira goes to enlist Alonso's help in assassinating Pizarro, she finds Rola instead. And they agree together to murder Pizarro. They sneak into his tent, but Rola cannot kill a sleeping man and instead wakes him to speak to him, and then revealing Elvira's plot. Pizarro then condemns her to death and decides to free Rola, recognizing him as an honorable warrior. Alonso and Cora have then, by this time, reunited, but the Spanish soldiers kidnap their young son Fernando as they are distracted in their joy of being reunited. As Rola is leaving the Spanish camp after being freed, he comes upon the soldiers who have captured this baby. And Pizarro, who's at the point when Rola enters, giving instructions that the child be thrown off of a cliff. When Rola identifies the baby as Alonso's son, Pizarro then decides that he will actually keep him hostage as a way to capture Alonso again. Rola is horrified by this and makes a daring rescue of the baby, but is wounded as he escapes over a collapsing bridge, although he does live long enough to return the baby covered in his own blood to Cora. In the very final scene, Pizarro attacks the Peruvian forces once again in their secret gathering place, and while he and Alonso fight, Elvira, who had been condemned to death a few scenes earlier, appears dressed in her nun's robes. She's distracting Pizarro long enough that Alonso kills him in the midst of their fight. The play ends with both the joy of the Spanish defeat and then a speech by Elvira in which she expresses remorse and counsels the Spanish to reconsider their greed and violent ways. And then finally, the sorrow of Rola's magnificent funeral is the final cue. This final scene of Pizarro's death is a major part of Sheridan's adaptation.
Now, when and where was Pizarro first performed, and what was notable about its cast?
So the play, as Alex has mentioned already, was first mounted at the Royal Theatre, Drury Lane, which is one of the 3 patent theatres, which has a license to perform serious drama. It's also part of the London theatrical scene, which was a critical medium of popular culture and political commentary at that time. Sheridan had owned Drury Lane for over 20 years by 1799, as Alex has mentioned, although since the 1780s he'd been working as an opposition MP in Parliament. His lack of management skills, as well as his attention elsewhere, as well as the expectation of mounting costly productions with new scenery and impressive effects, meant that the theatre was always a losing concern. In 1791, in order to create space for larger audiences, Sheridan had the old Drury Lane, which was built in 1674, demolished. And the new Drury opened in 1794 with a cavernous auditorium that holding more than 3,600 people. It featured the latest in stage spectacle and scenic technologies and was built to withstand their rigorous demands, putting further strains on the company's finances through this huge renovation that took 3 years. So Sheridan was barely able to pay his leading actors, and in the 1798-99 season, they desperately needed a hit production as they were playing to empty houses, according to Matthew Monk-Lewis, who was one of the original collaborators on the work before he had a falling out with Sheridan. The play was being discussed in newspapers 6 months before it opened with great anticipation, as it was going to combine a number of huge talents, the very popular Kotzebue, as we've already discussed, Sheridan, who hadn't written a play in 20 years by this point, as well as the most famous celebrity actors of the time, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So after a rocky start, on opening night, it ran for 5 hours. It was later edited, although the length of time was also partly attributed because of a really important speech, which we'll discuss, spoken by John Philip Campbell, who played Rolla, which was very patriotic. And throughout the run, certainly the first night and then throughout the run, audiences would regularly stop Campbell and make him repeat the speech over and over again, which certainly added to the length of time of the play. It ran for 31 nights and saved Drury Lane from bankruptcy. It then entered the tragic repertoire with Rolla, the Peruvian hero, being compared to Shakespeare's Othello and Brutus. And its popularity was also enhanced by the Royal Command performance when the King George III came back to Drury Lane for the first time in 5 years, and ran regularly in the next season as well, with playbill advertisements indicating that it was being brought back to satisfy those who'd been turned away.
So I'll set out some of the wider context as well. So in 1799, when the play opened, Britain was at war with France, soon to be Napoleonic France. And many critics have thought that the character of Pizarro, the way that Sheridan characterizes him, is partly based on accounts of Napoleon, hot-headed, big temper, thinking about principle rather than practicalities and so on. Oh, and violent and ravenous and all kinds of other things. People in Britain were actually convinced that at any moment they were going to be invaded by the French. This has been going on for 2 or 3 years. And in fact, the very, very last time in British history that a foreign invasion force successfully landed in Britain had happened about 2 years before, in February of 1797, when 20 French sailors landed at a place called Fishguard in southwest Wales. And they were captured almost immediately and sent home. And that was the last successful invasion. But people were in a bit of a state of panic. And one of the ways that Sheridan made his play so popular was to associate the British, so the soon-to-be victims of a French invasion, with the Peruvian people on stage, who appear in the play to be exceedingly British, through Rolla particularly, as we'll talk about. The other important thing that was happening at the time was there was this vogue for Spanish America. Kotzebue's play was itself not original. It was based in part on a historical novel, Les Incas, by Jean-François Marmontel, which had been translated into English in 1777. And that novel had been in turn inspired by François Raynal's philosophical and political history of the settlements and trade of the Europeans in the East and West Indies. And another influential work that appeared about the same time was the Scottish historian William Robertson's History of America, which has a long section on the Spanish invasion of the Americas and the conquistadors, and in particular on Pizarro. Pizarro is a major figure in all of these, along with Alonso de Molina, and other figures who appear in the play, although not Rolla. Rolla is Kotzebue's original invention. But at any rate, in all of these historical works, the conquistadors, and especially Pizarro, appear to be very violent. But the real target in a lot of them is actually the Catholic Church. These are French and Scottish Enlightenment figures who are writing against a restrictive and restrained church infrastructure, and they're advocating right of conscience and commercial liberty and so on. And they tend to view the Peruvians as anticipating those values. So they're noble savages in some respect, but they're also kind of proto-British believers, or almost proto-American believers in personal improvement and liberty and so on, being led by Alonso, the European improver. So the popularity of these histories was also intensified by the Mestizaje rebellions in Peru and Colombia in the 1770s, and Bolivia. And interesting, in the early 1790s, there was an embassy of representatives from these rebellions in London, seeking funding from the British government for their struggles against Spain. And this was happening at precisely the time when Britain was still reeling from its losses in the United States, fighting to retain its holdings in the Caribbean against the French, and intensifying its rule in India. So this kind of ambivalence about colonialism is really what's at stake in Sheridan's play. So one of the things that we tried to present in the edition is that the play is completely entangled with the contradictions of Britain's imperial mandate. And so Selena's already mentioned Rolla's speech, this very patriotic speech in Act 2 that Rolla had to give again and again and again. In that speech, Rolla compares the invading Spanish to vultures and the Peruvians to lambs. And this image actually comes from a speech that Sheridan himself had given in 1788, when he and other Whig opposition politicians were prosecuting a man named Warren Hastings in the House of Lords. Hastings had been the governor of Bengal in India for the East India Company, and he was accused of having manipulated several Indian princes into terrible deals for his own personal gain. Sheridan made a speech absolutely excoriating Hastings over 4 days. It was really a theatrical event in and of itself. At the end of these speeches, Sheridan fainted rather dramatically into the arms of his friend, the rhetorician and political philosopher Edmund Burke, saying, "My lords, I have done." But what's interesting is that this speech very much makes the English look like the colonial oppressors, whereas in Rollo's speech, they are the victims. And this is a point we make several times in the edition. Pizarro helped to cultivate these two sides of British imperialism. On one hand, we know we are oppressors and victors, and on the other hand, we love liberty and we identify strongly with the indigenous victims of imperial oppression. Rollo, by the way, was played by John Philip Kemble, who's one of Sheridan's stars. And Kemble was known for playing brave, stoic types. His style of performance was very rational, but brawny and heroic. He epitomizes the stiff deportment that actors of this time were known for, kind of the George Clooney of his era. And his portraits show this really well, including those in which he appears as Rolla. In one of these, by Sir Thomas Lawrence, which was painted in 1800, Kemble actually had a body double. The head was Kemble's, and the body was that of the boxer drawn gentleman Jackson, to make Rolla look really impressively, buff. Anyway, the speech that Sheridan adapted from the Hastings trial is the one that Selena described in Act 2, in which he cajoles the people to take up arms against the invaders. And this is the high point of the play, at which Rolla had to do again and again and again. Interestingly, a few years later, in 1803, when a brief period of peace between France and England fell apart, the Peace of Amiens fell apart, Sheridan actually published Rolla's speech as a standalone poster or broadsheet entitled Sheridan's Address to the People. And we have a version of that in the edition as well. And I think Selena's going to talk about Siddons and Jordan.
Yeah, there's a few other really important casting choices we need to talk about to really fully understand this original production, and even also how Sheridan made choices as he adapted the play. So the first one I'll talk about is Sarah Siddons. So Siddons is Kemble's older sister, also a very famous actor, probably even the most famous celebrity at the time. And Sheridan significantly adapted the role of Elvira to suit Siddons' both her public persona and her acting abilities. She was 44 years old when it opened and had been a London acting sensation since the 1782 season. She was really came on the scene and then was immediately considered a very, very fine actor. And she was appointed by the king to be to the reader in English to the royal children in 1783. She was very famously painted by Joshua Reynolds as the tragic muse in 1784, which, according to Joseph Roach, in his book, It, was an expression of her iconic status as the tragedy queen that she played both on and off the stage. Siddons was particularly famous for her Lady Macbeth, a figure associated with madness brought on by remorse as well as great ambition. She first performed Lady Macbeth in London in 1785, and then the part stayed in her repertoire until her retirement from the stage in 1812. She was renowned in the role so much that Charles Lamb, in his work on the tragedies of Shakespeare, in which he argues against the performance of Shakespeare, cites her performance as one of the reasons why Shakespeare shouldn't be on the stage, because somebody like Siddons overwhelms Shakespeare's text, and we can't actually even think about Lady Macbeth without thinking of Siddons. So Siddons had 7 children, 3 of whom had died by the time she performed Elvira. Her public persona was very carefully managed. She was always known as Mrs. Siddons, and although her performances were full of emotional and sexual power, her offstage identity was based on her role as a wife and a mother, and indeed a grieving mother at this point because of the loss of her children. She was also known to be able to move rapidly between passions in her acting. And in terms of a public persona, she also, in 1789, during the Regency crisis, when King George III was ill, once he recovered, she was then enlisted to play Britannia, the female personification of the country, in order to celebrate King George's recovery. So that was kind of her status. And Sheridan carefully designed Siddons, the role of Elvira, to match Siddons' abilities, and as well as this public persona she had as an idealized British sort of remorseful colonialist, I guess we'd say. In Kotzebue's play, the character of Elvira betrays Pizarro for the love of Alonso, and then is not yet seen again after she's sent away to be tortured. So that it's sort of a crass motivation in Kotzebue's play. Elvira is Pizarro's mistress. She follows him to the camp. She falls in love with somebody else and then tries to kill him. So she's kind of a pretty base character in lots of ways, although a very interesting one. In Sheridan's version, he expands Elvira's speeches throughout. She makes many, many speeches, many of which have commentary on moral choice and heroism, and she remonstrates Pizarro for his cowardly nature, and then her motivation in Sheridan's version is shifted away from an attraction to Alonso, instead to a moral choice, that she no longer supports Pizarro because of his vile, base nature. So the most significant change also comes with Sheridan's new ending. So as I mentioned before, Kotzebue's play ends when Rolla returns Alonso and Cora's child, and he dies, and that's the end of the original play. Sheridan adds a final confrontation in which Alonso kills Pizarro, and at first, during the fight, Alonso seems to be losing, but then that fight turns on Elvira's entrance, which startles Pizarro and then allows Alonso to kill him. And one of the reasons that Pizarro is so startled is because she appears dressed as a nun, which is when he originally met her, but she'd given up her calling in order to follow him. But she comes back dressed in those original clothing. And then once he's dead, she then has her final speech in which she declares her intention to atone for her guilt and advises all the invaders to return to Spain and inform their rulers that greed and conquest do not make a nation great. And then I would also say that message is further underscored by the actor's presence, which combines that ideal of British womanhood and, along with the nun's habit, visually cites her famous portrayal of Lady Macbeth in the sleepwalking scene when she is gone mad with remorse. So contemporary reviewers found Siddons's portrayal of Elvira to be one of mixed dignity and tenderness and the best in the piece. And Samuel Bardsley wrote that Siddons's characterization rendered lofty sentiments, energetic language, and forcible depictions of virtuous struggles of repentance and remorse. So Siddons's acting skill and celebrity gave her the ability to command an enormous salary, approximately £113,000 per night in contemporary currency. Dorothy Jordan, the other famous cast member that I'm going to talk about in a minute, also earned an enormous amount of money, by about half of what Siddons earned per night. So these were the actors that drew in the crowds at Drury Lane that they needed so badly, but they were also the actors whose salaries Sheridan could not pay until the success of this play. So I'll also just talk briefly about Dorothy Jordan, although we could say a lot about her too. She's a really fascinating person. So she was the other main female lead in Pizarro, playing Cora, the Peruvian woman who's married to Alonso. And though not as iconic as Siddons, with a very, very different career, Jordan was also a significant performer in the late 1790s. She arrived in London unmarried and with a child when she was 21 years old in 1782. She was soon hired by Sheridan and began a relationship with the co-owner of Drury Lane, a lawyer named Richard Ford, with whom she had 2 children. When Ford refused to marry her, she left him for William, the Duke of Clarence, who was the 3rd son of King George III and the future King William IV. Their affair was a tremendous scandal, and as a member of the royal family, William could not choose whom to marry, and nevertheless his family would never have approved of Jordan with her illegitimate children and as well as her stage profession. They endured scandalous press attention and caricatures, never-ending caricatures, which eventually waned when they began living together and having children. They stayed together for 20 years and had 10 children, all of whom, despite their illegitimacy, were eventually given the surname Fitzclarence and accepted as the king's grandchildren. When Pizarro opened in 1799, Jordan and the Duke were a well-established couple, and she was pregnant with their 5th child. The 4th child, Mary, was 5 months old, and as per acting custom of the day, accompanied her mother on stage as the baby in the play. In contrast to Siddons' motherly demeanor, Jordan had a spontaneous comic style, an harmonious voice, and amazing curly hair, as well as a fine appearance in boys' clothes, and she was known for playing breeches parts. So although we don't have time to go into it in much detail, we argue in our introduction to Pizarro that the choice to cast Jordan as Cora, the grieving mother, instead of Siddons, is deeply related to Jordan's offstage relationship with the Duke and the political implications of Sheridan's adaptation, where if Jordan was Elvira, then the Duke would possibly be Pizarro, which would then implicate the royal family in certain ways, and would jeopardize the already tenuous patriotism of the play. So what we do know is that Siddons is cast as Elvira, bringing her physical presence of the ideal British womanhood, strength, and remorse to the role, and Jordan was cast as Cora, the adored and distressed Peruvian wife to the Spanish deserter Alonso, and mother to their mestizaje son, Fernando. And this family configuration of Alonso, Cora, and Fernando has multiple implications as the play starts to circulate and travel and gets interpreted in various ways, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yes, in your introduction, you write that Pizarro was not only, and I'm quoting directly here, the most popular play of its time, but you also say that it was a work that was the first to do a number of important things. And I'm curious, what were some of these really important firsts?
So one of the important things that Pizarro did that, as far as we're concerned, hadn't really happened before was incorporate music all the way through the production rather than just between acts. Because Drury Lane was one of the three theaters royal, what that meant, one of the things that meant was that opera wasn't allowed to be performed, only serious theater. And opera was performed at the Haymarket Theater down the road, but it wasn't allowed on the legitimate theaters. And this goes back to the Licensing Act of 1737, which had been passed in order to curtail political satire on the London stages, which often appeared in disguised form inside songs. So you couldn't have singing on stage during the play because that was a really good opportunity for people to make fun of important politicians. Well, the politicians didn't want that. So music on the Theatres Royal was only allowed between the acts, and it wasn't allowed to be used in the performances. And now Sheridan keeps the music between the acts, and there are elaborate stage directions for the music. But he also adds songs and processions and musical leitmotifs all through the play, which makes the play sometimes feel, rather operatic, on a pretty grand scale. And some of this music was by well-known musicians from the time that Sheridan and the theater composer Michael Kelly had pulled in, and some was by Kelly himself. And in fact, Kelly's reminiscences are full of stories about how Sheridan, for instance, on one occasion, pulled him out of a dinner party and dragged him to the theater and then made him watch and look at the sets and watch the actors so that he could compose the music right away, which Kelly, to his credit, seems to have done. And in fact, the music was very popular in and of itself. Kelly published all the music from Pizarro and all the songs separately in 1802, and this went through several editions in itself. Sheridan also contributed some original lyrics, specifically for Cora's song, which is the song that Jordan sang over her child when she thinks that Alonso is gone forever. And it was also published on its own and entered into the regular musical repertoire all the way through the 19th century.
Another important part about the sort of firsts of the play has to do with the set. As was expected at the time, the set was magnificent and featured changing scenery and special effects, and also had a collapsing bridge, which was the first time this was used. I'll describe a little bit about the set, and then I'll talk about that collapsing bridge. So the scene shifts between starting with a magnificent pavilion near Pizarro's tent with a view of the Spanish camp in the background, to Peruvian scenes in the wild woods and stupendous rocks at the elaborate Temple of the Sun, which the script tells us represents the magnificence of Peruvian idolatry. Staging the Incan Temple of the Sun, or indigenous sun worship, had been recurring on English stages since the evidence the cruelty of the Spaniards of Peru, and most recently, prior to Sheridan's Pizarro, being Morton's Columbus. So that Temple of the Sun, although it is magnificent, is definitely not one of the firsts in this play. That's a reiteration of a long-standing English staging. The set also includes a Spanish dungeon in which Alonso is kept prisoner until Rolla frees him, and they're very important for the climactic effect of the rescue of the baby, as a wild rocky background with a torrent falling down the precipice over which a bridge is formed by a felled tree. This bridge was a collapsing set piece that had to be triggered in the midst of the rescue of the baby, as Rolla ran over it and pulled its supports free to prevent pursuit. So as Daniel O'Quinn argues, the bridge scene is also a metaphor for the way in which the play crosses the political and aesthetic realms. And Julie Carlson, in her discussion of the race and profit in English theatre, also comments on this collapsing bridge and the set and the sort of importance of this first enactment of that. Emphasizing how after Pizarro, there were many plays concerning Africans from the early 19th century that staged hanging bridges and rescues, and calling this a visual cross-referencing of scenes in plays that were critical of the colonial power, encouraging sympathetic viewers to read or that is preview, the new play from a position of resistance. So the collapsing bridge, which now we recognize from, it's a very, very common trope in many action movies, particularly. I think it's Indiana Jones
and The Man Who Would Be King, the final scene, they cut the bridge and the bridge collapses with
so this is sort of a
hero on it.
But it comes back to Pizarro. So the set design was also enhanced by new technologies, which made the play's special effects, such as the elaborate staging of the proving ritual during the Temple of the Sun, scene with a fireball descending from on high, or the thunder and lightning during chorus song, and of course the rocky precipice with a cascading waterfall and bridge. It's really hard to represent all of this in a text, which we did. We did our best to try and really draw the reader's attention to these things, but it's really, unfortunately, there's a lot of visuals that go along with the ephemera, so we can have representations of that, but it's hard to imagine.
So it really sounds like this play became a cultural phenomenon. I'm wondering how it kind of worked its way into pop culture at the time, and what that sort of said about theater's role in society at this sort of right at the turn of the 19th century.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we spent a lot of time sort of considering in the background of our work. So we've already talked a little bit about why Pizarro became so popular and why it was written in the way that it was. Vis-a-vis the Hastings trial and the invasion scare and the two sides of imperialism and the celebrity actors that Sheridan has at its disposal. And Sheridan knew what he was doing. He was pushing all the buttons he could, kind of all at once, mashing his hands against the buttons to make this play work. And I think that's one answer, to the question. But it's also, I think, important, as your question suggests, that to remember that theater was, at this moment in the 1790s, was really part of the apparatus of political persuasion in the period. And that's why it's so interesting that Sheridan comes back from a career in politics and is doing that simultaneously. He's a theater manager and an impresario, really. He's the impresario of this era. And what he's doing is he's giving people in Britain, from all classes and society, cultural models that they need to justify to themselves this really bizarre place that they have in the world, as on the one hand, imperial oppressors, and on the other hand, as the potential victims of imperial outrage. And so he does this very careful thing of constructing this, again, heavily in big quotes, native figure that is associated with Britishness at the same time as Britishness is also patriotically associated with empire. And what Selena said about the set really goes well with this. When you see in a really heroic way an act of rebellion against invasion, it helps to legitimize a national identity that might be struggling on one hand against invasion, but which is also invading and exploiting other places. And this is actually something that in a lot of political rhetoric today we see all the time. A great way to justify imperial action is to claim that it's done in the service against potential imperial victimization. But I think also because of this spectacle, plays like Pizarro had a critical role, very much like that held today by shows and films that were also combined high sentiment and spectacle. Think of something like Game of Thrones or, the new Star Wars films opens today, and it's got that kind of feel to it and so on. And these kinds of popular cultural spectacles, you're working through the dilemmas and contradictions of invasion and war and racism and liberty and empire. Words that we often take for granted, we use all the time, but which really need to be unpacked. And we often associate this period with these kinds of big political and philosophical contradictions that we call, romanticism. And often we do that with poetry, if you think about the big poets of this era, like William Wordsworth or Percy Shelley or even Jane Austen in some respects. But scholars are becoming to realize that it was in the theater, which the Romantics all wrote for and were all huge fans of, was the place where these, chewy political issues were actually being acted out. And the popularity of Pizarro is one indication for us of just how much this chewiness was making its way into the social zeitgeist in Britain in this time. You can also see this in the extensive critical commentary on the play, a lot of which we've tried to reproduce in the appendices to our edition. And it shows people, critics and viewers, working through exactly these kinds of questions in a lot of instances. I mean, whole books were written about Pizarro because it was such a huge cultural event. And while to some extent these writers were also cashing in on that popularity, they were also asking things like, hey, Elvira is both a nun and a fallen woman, and she appears as both of these figures all the way through the play. How do we handle these kinds of contradictions? And so while Pizarro was popular, it's not to be kind of considered, dross, as some antagonistic critics believed at the time, and a lot of people have made it out to be since. I think it tells us that people in Britain were actually thinking through important political and moral issues of their time by way of the plays that they were all dying to watch.
Yes, and as both of you have touched upon a number of times already in this interview, one of the most sort of interesting contradictions, dilemmas that we can almost see the audience wrestling with is shown in this depiction of the native peoples of South America. I'm curious what you find particularly interesting, noteworthy about how Pizarro treats the native characters, and I'm also curious what you think this has to say about sort of colonialism and its legacy.
Sure. I mean, there's so much to really work through in the play. But first, to start by making clear that the depiction of the peoples from the Andes in this play is entirely of an imaginary indigeneity, which, because of the volatile dynamics of the 19th century, can be put to political use in many ways by numerous constituencies. And while it is based on extensive European sources, as Alex has already detailed, much of these are entangled in the European conflicts over religion and over vying for colonial resources and lands. And they depict the Incans as civilized but tragically defeated by these ruthless Spaniards. But this ambivalence allowed the play to circulate around the world and carry meanings in various places. So there's some place like the U.S. where Pizarro was performed in a few months after it first appeared on Drury Lane, and then every season thereafter in New York City until 1863. So Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, in her book New World Drama, describes the American interest in Pizarro as linked to an effort by settlers to create an indigenous white Creole identity to support the nationalist identity at the time called American nativism. Pizarro first evokes an English and then an American performative commons through the marriage of Alonzo and Cora in particular, which we spoke about earlier, and the creation of their family. In the context of the newly formed U.S., the most significant plot revolves around Rolla attempting to keep the family intact. So Rolla sacrifices himself. He becomes sort of the tortured dead Indian on stage so that this new Creole family can exist. So Dillon explains that the triangulation of politics in an American audience would be instead of Spanish, English, Peruvians, it would be understood as the metropolitan English, the Creole Americans, and the Native Americans of the U.S. There's other really interesting sort of circulations of this. Rolla was Ira Aldridge's debut performance in the early years of the African Theatre Company, which Dillon characterizes as a performative expression of horizontal relations between differently colonized peoples, that's sort of taking up as Rolla as the hero. And Rolla eventually becomes so well known that T.D. Rice cites him through costume when he has Jim Crow play a South American prince in one of his Jim Crow plays The Peacock and the Crow in 1837, which actually is performed. He travels and performs that in England. The Mormons also performed Sheridan's Pizarro to express beliefs about their own indigeneity and persecution by outsiders. It was first staged in 1844 by a Mormon group raising funds for Joseph Smith's defense, featured professional actors as well as major church leaders. Alonzo was played by Erastus Snow, and the Peruvian high priest was played by Brigham Young. So the play became known as the Mormon National Play, opening the first theater in Utah and then was performed yearly between 1863 and 1874. So the malleable cosmopolitical futurity of the play is also demonstrated by the many translations and adaptations in India. There are 4 different versions extant, 2 in Marathi, 1 each in Urdu and Gujarati, which include adaptations such as a Hindu Elvira as the captive of the Muslim Pizarro and rescued by Rolla, her Hindu lover, or in another version, Spain and Peru are replaced by Turkey and India. So the legacy of Pizarro and its deployment of indigeneity is highly ambivalent. It began as part of a Eurocentric reckoning with the imperial project, as we've discussed, and then ricocheted around the world in adaptations by those critical of fighting against or reimagining imperialism. It's also really fascinating to study Pizarro, as there is a corresponding performance history that centers not on an imagined Peruvian victory over Pizarro from this European source, but is rather on the death of Ataliba, whose Incan name is Atahualpa. And that tradition began as a 16th century Andean dance drama. The first written report is in 1555, a few years after Atahualpa's death. And versions of this drama of invasion are still performed at festivals in Peru and Bolivia in a mix of Spanish and Quechua. One such performance is represented in the text The End of Atahualpa, a Tragedy by Jesus Lara, which is published in Diana Taylor and Sarah Townsend's Stages of Conflict. And the play centers Inca experiences, showing their relationships, trauma, and engagement with fate. It invokes indecipherability throughout, and even in the final scene has the King of Spain being rendered speechless when confronted by Pizarro's beheading of the Inca. Once the king regains his ability to speak, he then orders Pizarro burned at the stake for his wrongdoing in this Andean dance drama version. So in the end, Sheridan's Pizarro, in its first production and then its extensive afterlife, demonstrates a metaphorical power of a constructed indigeneity in the European imaginary as a way to denote a moral heroism and a right to land.
Now, Selena and Alex, I think for those of our listeners who might not know sort of what goes into editing a play like this, I'd be really curious to hear sort of what the process is like for the two of you and what you're trying to do in creating this Broadview edition of the play.
Yeah, well, it took us 5 years to edit it and produce this play, and we should thank Broadview and our editors at Broadview for their patience, which was wonderful. They let us get on with it, and they gave us lots of time and scope and great, and that was fantastic. I've actually known about Pizarro for some time. I mean, I'm primarily a romanticist, and I studied literature and politics in the period around 1800. But I wrote my PhD dissertation on the drama of this period, and so I got interested in Pizarro and Sheridan at that time. And in 2012, was it 2012? Yeah, I taught a graduate seminar here at UBC on British romantic drama, and I put Pizarro on the syllabus. And Selena was in that class. She was a PhD student here, and she wrote a brilliant essay on the play, on Elvira and Sheridan's transitions in her role. And this has been published in Theatre Journal, right? Yeah. And when the play just taught really, really, really well, because it had all the chewy stuff in it that we've been talking about today, colonialism and spectacle and politics and so on. So the idea of this edition came largely from that experience. Broadview seemed like the best venue, since they're known for this sort of publishing of critical editions with lots of apparatus where we could put a long introduction and lots of notes and then all these appendices with some of the contextual material that we've talked about today. But it's only when we started working on the play that we realized just how much stuff this play produced. Not just its 19th century legacy, which would be a monograph in itself to document, and which we're not going to write. But we collected this huge number of articles and newspaper clippings and reviews and books and from the period. And we were very lucky that Daniel O'Quinn, who's at the University of Guelph, who's written quite a bit on this play, he actually mailed us this giant stack of photocopies that he made, 10 years ago, and delivered to us. And a lot of that material is also searchable and online now, thank goodness. So all the newspapers from the 1790s, and so you can look at the reviews. And we had to work through all of that. We also had to work through all the historical background on South America that we discussed. We went to London, to the theater archive at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I highly recommend to your listeners because it's a wonderful site. And we worked our way through their collection of prints and posters and political cartoons, and that were all associated with the play. The V&A even had a series of commemorative plates celebrating the play and featuring images of all the main characters, although they wouldn't let us photograph them because they're quite delicate, and they're being held back. We went to the British Library. We found translations into Tamil. We found musical scores, and on and on and on it went. And most of this work involved getting all this material together in a form that was compact and readable. Interestingly enough, the play was pretty easy to edit. Sheridan published a version of the play to coincide with its performance. This came out in early June of 1799, but it didn't have any of the music or songs in it. And this sort of, except for Cora's song, the poem that Sheridan contributed, and this went through something like 21 editions in the first year, which is an enormous number of editions for a play being published to coincide with a performance. So luckily, this was published so fast, there weren't very many corrections. So we didn't have much to do in terms of the kind of close editorial scrutiny that you would have to use, say, with a Shakespeare play, where there are lots of different editions available, quarto and folio. And so there's nothing like that is apparent in Pizarro. But instead, we were allowed to situate the play in these cultural settings, in its performance history and in its colonial context, these multiple plural contexts Because as we've said, there are many, and they're varied, and they're all equally important. But also, instead of just the published text, we got access to John Philip Kemble's prompt book for the play. Now, when Kemble left the Drury Lane Company, he moved to Covent Garden, and he took Pizarro with him, as it were, and staged it again in 1807 for the first time, and then several years after that. And the Folger Society in Washington, D.C. has published Kemble's prompt book from these later productions, which includes all of his director's notes and a lot of his changes. He kind of cleaned up the play. He made it a little less controversial. We also had access, thanks to David Francis Taylor, who's now at Warwick University, to one of the original manuscript translations, which is held at Harvard. For some of his research, Taylor had transcribed this manuscript, and he was generous enough to send it to us, which was great. And so we were able to look at some of that and to incorporate some elements of the editorial changes which the play have produced. And we've got an image of one of the pages of the prompt book showing Kemble's changes. So our editorial process was really focused as much on the performance and performance legacies of the play rather than on the textual, because as you pointed out, the play is, crazy, but it's not textually sophisticated in the way that we often think. It just has this amazing cultural presence at this very precise moment and then after, which people know less about than they probably should. So what we're trying to do with the edition is show to readers and students how we can engage with the drama and its performance history in a way that also speaks to some of the pressing concerns of our own time, such as empire, such as indigeneity, such as invasion, and the kind of anxieties that attend it. And really that inspired all the work that we did for as long as it took to produce this edition.
We'll post additional information about Selena and Alex's new edition of Pizarro in our show notes, as well as additional links and reading suggestions that will let you further explore the play's historical and cultural context. Selena and Alex, thank you so much for telling us about the fascinating story behind this hit play.
So I'm glad.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you so much for asking a lot about it.
Yeah, and thanks for listening.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes and email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our intro and outro music this week are The Grand March and Dead March from Pizarro, both of which were composed by Michael Kelly for the original production of Sheridan's play. They come to us courtesy of Mark Douglas, who is responsible for music consulting and transcription. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.